Hello everybody, and welcome back to the Sanctuary. I'm your host, Professor C, and we're going to continue our discussion about A and P, specifically more bones today. Which one shall we pick? Let's try the frontal and parietal bones. Let's get to it. Alright, so let's check out the frontal bone to begin with. Again, I can slap a big F right there and say there's the frontal bone where your forehead is, just to remind us, but let's get to some specifics. A superciliary arch. All right, if I could highlight that in this image, I would kind of show this lump and this lump. They're not perfectly symmetrical in this picture, but nothing really is, to be honest. But those are called these superciliary arches. The space in between them, which would be right here, this little triangular area right there, is called the G glabella. That's the glabella. Frontal eminence. This one's kind of hard to see in almost every picture. If you can pick up a skull, if you have one laying around, you can notice there are two lumps right here, and you may be able to put your own hand on your forehead and feel those. We often rub those when we're concerned about something or we're in deep thought. We'll put our hand on our forehead and we'll rub those frontal eminences. It almost looks like you can get some horns growing out of here if you could picture it in your mind. Where those horns would grow here, that would be the two frontal eminences. Zygomatic process. Again, wait a minute. I thought we just saw a zygomatic process. Well, that was the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. We have another zygomatic process here of the frontal bone. So it's going to be another one of these bridging processes that reaches for the zygomatic bone. Again, zygomatic bone is here with the Z on it, and here with the Z on it, this cheekbone. So right here, where the frontal bone comes down, there is your zygomatic process. Let's see if I can fit a ZP right there. There's another one on this side. Zygomatic process of the frontal bone, not the zygomatic process of the temporal bone, which I can barely see in this picture, but let's ignore it and move on. Supraorbital margin. Okay, the word orbital refers to the eye sockets, so the place where the eye would go. Supra would mean the top of it, and we all know, I think, what a margin is. So a supraorbital margin would be this margin right here, and this, where I'm drawing, margin right there, supraorbital margin. Near that supraorbital margin, you may find a hole. I'm going to get rid of my ink real quick just to make it all go away. You may find a hole right there, and that's called a supraorbital foramen. Remember, foramen is a hole. It's somewhere in the superciliary arch, supraorbital margin area. Sometimes you'll notice that, like here, it doesn't quite form a discrete hole. It looks more like there's a notch in the bone instead of a hole like in the other side. In that case, we would call it a supraorbital notch, and I have another picture of that in a moment. Speak of the devil, here it is. So notice on this side, which would be the left side of this person's skull, they have a discrete hole here above the orbital. So that would be here a supraorbital foramen. However, on the right side of the skull, and this can happen, that foramen is lower in the skull than the other one is, so it merges with that supraorbital margin. And instead of a discrete hole again, we have a notch. So it depends on what you're looking at. If it's a discrete actual hole, it's a supraorbital foramen. If the hole is part of the supraorbital margin, it's often referred to as a supraorbital notch. Now, a metopic suture is not shown here. If I could draw it, I would need to have, first of all, an infant skull. So I'm assuming the skull in this picture is an adult, is why I don't see it. But if you could see an infant skull, you would see a little crack right here where the glabella is. Right? Remember, the glabella is that V-shaped structure in between the superciliary arches. Well, that crack there is called a metopic suture. It will fuse completely as the little one grows into a big one. And as an adult, the metopic suture should not be visible anymore because it would be completely fused together. All right, the parietal bone, pretty easy. I mean, I can pop a P on parietal so we see it there. There's not really much to talk about. We talked about the four main sutures that surround it. But on most anatomy labs, they have what's called reference to a superior and inferior temporal line. I'm going to draw this two different ways. Here would be the inferior temporal line, even though it's on the parietal bone. And here would be the superior temporal line, even though it's on the parietal bone. And you say, hey, that kind of reminds me of that temporal fossa you drew here earlier. And yes, that would mark the border of the temporal fossa, and that ridge of bone there in between the superior and inferior temporal lines allows some of those big chewing muscles to attach to the skull so you can get some power. Let's do it again on the skull on the right. So this would be your inferior temporal line, even though it's part of the parietal bone and frontal bone. Here is the superior temporal line, even though it's on the parietal bone. Again, why it's called that is because it marks the boundary of this temporal fossa that includes all of that area right there. All right, thanks for watching about the frontal and parietal bones. If you liked it, check out some more videos in the series. See you for the next one. Bye-bye.